Hi, and welcome to this session on Veeam ONE Scalability Best Practices. My name is Kevin Ridings. I'm a Senior Systems Engineer for Veeam Software. Before we begin, would someone just be able to comment to the quality of my audio in the chat session, if possible, just so I know that you can hear me, so I can actually make sure, yes, that you can actually hear me. Okay, not getting any feedback there. I, at the moment, think my audio is okay, so I'm going to proceed. But please, if you are in fact hearing this, please do respond. So what we're going to be focusing on today is about how to scale Veeam ONE, and we're going to take a look at the new scalability features and how to make best use of these. But just to look at a short agenda. So we're going to be going through initially a Veeam ONE introduction, just for some of the attendees that are not that familiar with Veeam ONE. We'll go through that short introduction. Then we'll move on to the new scalability features. And then we'll switch to a live demo to take a look about how you can access some of those features that we've been discussing. Then back to the deck for some scalability best practices. And then at the end of the session, we can look at some additional features that are coming and also take any questions. So please use the questions section of the webinar here to pop your questions in there, and I will attempt to answer those at the end. Okay, so moving through to what is Veeam ONE? Well, Veeam ONE is a monitoring, capacity planning, and reporting tool. It takes metrics from VMware vSphere, vCloud Director, Microsoft Hyper-V, and of course, Veeam Backup and Replication. And it creates, once we've got those metrics and run them through the Veeam ONE engine, it does produce that, as I said, 24/7 real-time monitoring, alerting, able to trigger alarms based on things such as VM performance and backup status to help avoid downtime. Look at resource optimization and configuration tracking, ensuring current configurations match known best practices. Also capacity planning and forecasting reports with things like what-if modeling, resource overcommit tracking, and also with the recent addition of chargeback and billing capabilities, really helping you gain that complete visibility into the cost of the provision of services within your environment. So where does Veeam ONE fit? Well, if we take a look at Veeam's 5 key capabilities. So if we first look at the first capability, high-speed recovery. So this is the Veeam ecosystem, the availability that we have. So looking at high-speed recovery, the features that we pop in the high-speed recovery capability is things like instant VM recovery, the Veeam Explorers, and things like instant file level recovery. Then we're moving on to the second capability, data loss avoidance. So here we're looking at things like backup from storage snapshots, remembering that Veeam Backup and Replication is 2-in-1 backup and replication. Things like scale-out backup repositories, and of course, end-to-end encryption. Then moving on to the third capability, verified recoverability. So in there, we're looking at things like Sure Backup and, of course, Sure Replica. And the fourth capability, leverage data. So things like virtual lab, on-demand sandbox, which can be performed from backups, replicas, and storage snapshots. But then looking at really where Veeam ONE starts to come in, and that's in our fifth pillar, and that's the complete visibility capability. It has the ability to no surprises in the environment, and always having the ability to understand what's happening, what's going to happen, and that's across those things that we just looked at. So that's across Veeam Backup and Replication, that's across VMware vSphere, vCloud Director, and of course Hyper-V. So there are a number of ways that you can experience Veeam ONE. And the first one is we have Veeam ONE Free Edition. So if you're not familiar with Veeam ONE, you can go ahead and use Veeam ONE Free Edition. Obviously, this is a stripped down version of the main standalone product, but it will give you an idea of what's possible. There is also a 30-day trial of the fully functional Veeam ONE as well, which is what I will be referring to here as the Veeam ONE standalone. So Veeam ONE in a licensed state, but not with any other product, giving you the ability to have full monitoring, reporting, capacity planning. But more often than not, we see Veeam ONE inside our Veeam Availability Suite. So the Veeam Availability Suite is the bundling of our flagship product, Veeam Backup and Replication, and Veeam ONE together. But it's also available in a product that you may have heard of, Veeam Backup Essentials. And just to be clear, Veeam Availability Suite and Veeam Backup Essentials are the exact same product. The differences here are how they're licensed. Veeam Backup Essentials gives you all that functionality that you have within the Availability Suite, but it's positioned at very small environments. So whether it's licensed per socket and looking at, yes, as I said, quite small environments that are looking at either maybe 2 sockets, so maybe 1 host, 4 sockets, 2 hosts, or a maximum of 6 sockets, which could be those 3 hosts, but giving you all that functionality that is available within the full Veeam Availability Suite. If we take a look at the history of Veeam ONE, so some of the people that have known Veeam for quite some time, such as myself, you will know that Veeam ONE became that one product in Q2 of 2012. Prior to that, you may have been familiar with things like Veeam Monitor, Veeam Reporter, and Veeam Business View. But in the second quarter of 2012, we brought those together in Veeam ONE. And then we brought real-time backup monitoring, infrastructure monitoring, alarms, dashboards, as you can see there. And then as we've gone through each release, 6.5, we brought in additional reporting and integrations. You can see in 7 there that we brought full support for vCloud Director. Then in version 8, full support for Veeam Cloud Connect. And then moving through 9, some additional performance and configuration assessment capabilities. And then in 9.5, the recent release, we added chargeback, and then we brought some enterprise scalability features, which is really where we're going to focus on today, about how you would scale that in an enterprise environment. But in fact, there's more than just the scalability enhancements that are available in 9.5. In fact, there are over 75 new features and functionality with, as I said, chargeback and billing functionality, full support for Hyper-V 2016. But really, the scalability enhancements are what we're going to focus on today and are really quite key, because we do see Veeam ONE being used in some really quite large-scale environments. So the scalability enhancements are particularly important here. So who should care? Well, I think where we're looking and the types of segments that we're looking at are enterprise level initially. So I would describe an enterprise level customer from a Veeam ONE point of view of having in excess of 5,000 VMs, in excess of 10 vCenters, maybe lots of standalone hosts as well, which can create additional metrics and also connections as well. But also in large enterprises, we see that they maybe don't or don't use one monitoring tool. So not wanting to use that single pane of glass, which is possible, but in larger enterprises, sometimes the desire is to use some of the focused tools. So having the flexibility to sit alongside other tools is something which is very important. And then maybe smaller, medium businesses, so that would be 500 plus VMs, which is where the scalability enhancements still fit with that small, medium business, but they've got a large number of VMs, but want great granularity. So still want to collect every single metric to be able to report on every single metric, but with still quite a relatively large number of machines, and also needing to fit particular SQL Server additions as well. And of course, Veeam Cloud and cloud service providers within our ecosystem really should care about these scalability enhancements that we're going to look at today, because that will really help them create the best use of Veeam ONE within their architectures. So what we did when we wanted to look at the scalability of Veeam ONE, we researched with our customers and we looked at what could be done to improve scaling. And these are what we found, really. Not all performance metrics are used. Veeam ONE collects a lot of performance metrics, hundreds for different types of objects, hosts, data stores, VMs, clusters, etc. for both VMware, vSphere, vCloud Director, as I mentioned earlier, Hyper-V, and of course, Veeam Backup Replication. In large environments, not all of these potentially are going to be used. If there is more than one monitoring tool, as I mentioned, it could be seen that some of the metrics, especially if those are the metrics related to another monitoring tool that was sat alongside, maybe it would be useful if we didn't collect those. So that could be something that would be quite useful. But also flexible retention. So prior to this release, we had the same retention across every single metric that we collected. So that could be backup data, vSphere data, Hyper-V data. Same retention for both of those, all of those in fact. But what we found with the research as well, even with some of the scalability enhancements that were already available, the majority of who we researched against were not aware of those scalability techniques. So hence probably why we're doing the session today. So some of the modifications that we've brought to 9.5, we've brought in data collection modes that can be affected and changed. So this really helps to separate out main metrics from supplementary metrics, and it gives you the ability to decide what is important. You also have the ability to configure the collector to filter necessary object types and get rid of the ones that you don't wish to collect. And we're going to take a look at that in a demo in a minute or so. But we've also brought a flexible retention, giving you the ability to basically free more space and not keeping data that's of no value to you. So we're going to look at a demo just now and look at where these settings can be changed. So hopefully you can see now this. I'm in my Veeam ONE monitor. This is the main UI of Veeam ONE, and you can see here we're looking at a very high-level overview of my particular demo environment, and I can see host state, data store state, and virtual machine state. So for the attendees that have not seen Veeam ONE before, this is the main screen that you would launch to give you that very high-level understanding of what's going on in the environment. You would also have the ability to click down and see much more detailed views, and you can also access all the reports that are available from here, even simply from a right click and going to all the reports that are in fact available for that object. So very easy interface to use. But to stay on focus, if we go take a look at the modifications, so that data collection, configurable collector, and the flexible retention, well, you want to go to options, down to server settings, then right along to other, and then we're going to launch the support utility. Now you may think that we've buried this button a little, but there's thought behind that. These modifications give you the ability to, as we're going to take a look at, alter the data collection, change the retention. So we didn't necessarily want this to be a button on the toolbar for every single user of Veeam ONE to just go and have a look and see what's possible. It's more for tuning when there is something that you need to tune. So if we take a look here and launch the support utility, here we are delivered the Veeam ONE settings in the support utility. So if we take a look at the retention policy settings, here is where you can change the retention for virtual infrastructure performance data retention, backup infrastructure performance data retention, and also events. It's quite likely, as you can see here in the defaults, not so much value keeping events for a long period of time. Maybe even events for 3 months could be considered a long time. But you can set it to your desired retention here quite easily from within this tool. If we go down to, and you can see here, this is something that wasn't been available before, you can see the scalability options. So we see the data collection mode, and there are some standard settings here. So you can see optimized for typical deployment, so less than 100 hosts, maybe 1,500 VMs. And if we actually look at the performance metrics that we're gathering in this mode, it's pretty much everything. So you can see here lots and lots of counters. You can go and see a particular counter. You can see we're gathering all those metrics. If we go back to the data collection mode screen and we highlight or select the optimize for advanced scalability deployment, so more than 100 hosts, more than 1,500 VMs, on our research, we analyzed what people in larger environments were wanting to see by default. And if we go to our performance metrics, you can see that there are some that we're not actually going to be taking, not going to be gathering here. But you have the ability to go and customize these as well. If you wanted to not gather anything from a particular host, you could turn them all off. So really giving you that ability to very finely tune the metrics that you see are valuable. And because of this fine tuning possible here, that's the reason that the button for using this particular configuration settings is a few menus down, just so it's not overused. Okay, so if we just come out of there, and I will leave it at that stage for now, and we'll flip back to the deck. So there are a number of additional modifications in 9.5 as well, but these are unseen. So these are not things that you can set or necessarily see, but certainly affect the performance in larger environments. So we have created a disk cache, so giving the ability for Veeam ONE to use less RAM. We're going to be able to keep and store performance data on the local guest operating system disks, giving the ability for us to access that somewhat faster. There's also incremental collection and mapping. So we're looking at the way that we collect data. So if those metrics have not changed, we won't collect them. So similar to sort of an incremental process of backup, if a metric hasn't changed, we won't pull it again. We'll just understand it hasn't changed. Really creates for a much faster process for getting that data. So some additional unseen modifications. There's been quite a lot of work on optimizing reports, and we have some examples that I'll talk about in a second around the types of reports and how much faster they actually are. In fact, a couple of sample reports. This is based on quite a large environment. So the examples that I'm going to mention here are based on an infrastructure with 20 vCenters, 140 clusters, 890 hosts, approximately 20,000 VMs, 2,300 data stores, so quite a large environment. So running the protected VM report back in 9 on this particular environment took 44 minutes. In the current release, it took 5 minutes. So really quite an improvement there. Just an example of another report, the host usage chargeback report in the prior release took about, in this environment, took 1 hour and 3 minutes. Current release, we're down to 12 minutes on that report. So you can see really quite a considerable change. Just one more example of a report, the VM change rate estimation. So looking at being able to estimate the rate of change on a virtual machine can be quite useful when scoping for backup. In previous release of Veeam ONE, 23 minutes. In the current release, we're down to 7 minutes. So really, quite a large change again. You can see there. So just moving on to the next unseen modification, and that's the independent data collection, allocation, and rendering of work in that process. Prior to 9.5, it was a serial process. So if there was an issue with collection and then allocation before rendering, the process, the collector, could actually get stuck. Now those tasks work in isolation and parallel, so giving you a far better and more resilient approach to the data collection. Okay. So moving on to best practices. So we're going to suggest some best practice here. Excuse me, I seem to be having a few problems with these slides. There we go. So I am still having some problems with those slides. Bear with me. Okay, I think we're stable. We're going to be suggesting some best practices here, so that recommendations about some of the things to start to do within the particular environment. And those recommendations are to separate out the Veeam ONE and the SQL Server role. So in a lot of the documentation, you will see having Veeam ONE and SQL Server on the same host. In larger environments, there's quite a heavy load on SQL Server in larger environments. So being able to separate those roles out would be a recommendation for larger scales. And we'll come on to sizing both the Veeam ONE server role and the SQL Server role in a couple of minutes. But also, it's something that it's unusual, but I do see in large environments. And the recommendation to put hosts under vCenter or SCVMM, depending on obviously whether it's vSphere or Hyper-V, to reduce the number of connections. Now, you would expect in large environments that there would not be standalone hosts, but I certainly see a lot of standalone hosts in dev teams and even in R&D, but still require monitoring. So having them, and the recommendation would be to make sure that they're all under vCenter or SCVMM, depending upon the platform, because then we're only having to connect to vCenter or SCVMM, not all those standalone hosts. Also, a recommendation for SQL Server in a very large environment is to use SSD. So having that very fast disk plane to be able to get the best performance from SQL. So moving on to Veeam ONE server sizing. So you can see here, this is actually, we've tested this, and as we sized a particular environment, these are the results that we got. So under 100 hosts, you can see there 4 to 8 CPUs, 8 gig of RAM, and 50 gig of disk. As you can see, as we scale 100 to 500 hosts, maybe 8 to 12, 32 gig of RAM, 500 to 1000 hosts, 12 to 16 CPUs, 50 gig of RAM, 100 gig of disk. And then as you see, as we go past 1000 hosts, upwards of 16 CPUs, upwards of 100 gig of RAM, and the disk doesn't really change. The disk is not so important, or the capacity of disk not so important for Veeam ONE when it's in a standalone role. You'll see on the next slide that the SQL Server sizing for disk is particularly is where you would need to focus. So if we move through to the SQL Server sizing, you can see here that similar CPU and RAM requirements as we looked at in the previous slide for just the Veeam ONE role itself, but then much more requirement on sort of disk footprint. As you can see, as we step through 100, 250 gig, 800 gig, 1.5 TB, as we see there. However, the size of those disks are very dependent upon the database size. And you can see there just on the slide itself, little asterisks to use the DB size calculator. Now we have a DB size calculator. There's a URL on the helpful links slide that I have towards the end of the deck here that you'll be able to use, because the actual database size is linked to around number of VMs, number of hosts, number of clusters, number of data stores, and an estimation then can be given on the size of the database that will be required. So moving through to some additional recommendations. So there is a recommendation to run SQL partitioning scripts to give you the ability to have more tables available within the SQL server. Also, configure data retention. So we looked at this earlier, the ability to change the data retention for the entire data set, but also down to backup, infrastructure performance metrics, and also backup retention. So different retention policies. But also, there is another way you can access the support settings, the utility tool that we looked at a few minutes ago in the demo that we accessed from the GUI. There is a secret mode that gives you more access to some additional settings. So using it within this secret admin mode, you have the ability to change some additional settings. So you have the ability to more finely tune and filter undesired vSphere data based around VMs, vSphere licensing information. So you can really filter out things that you don't see as value. And you can, again, more finely tune the data collection intervals as well for around performance data samples. So rather than collecting all the performance data in large environments, a sample set of data may be of value because of this huge amount of data that actually is maybe available there across the environment, and also tune those collection intervals a little more, but also tune some other Veeam ONE server settings as well. So with that, we're going to pop back into the demo environment. And what I'm going to do now, as we looked at before, we went down here, we went to server settings, other, and we went into launch. Well, it's not, as I mentioned, it's not available from in the GUI, so we hit it even more than this particular button here. So how you access this is by just running a command. The string of the command is available at the end of the deck. You can see here it's just running into the Veeam ONE settings exe within the footprint on the disk, but with an admin switch on the end there. So we run that, and it's going to bring up the same Veeam ONE settings bar, same Veeam ONE setting menu. However, you see some additional screens, so you have the ability to execute some SQL scripts. You see the same retention policy settings here, but as we go down into scalability, here we go. This is where you can see the performance cache that we mentioned before. This is the disk caching, but what you can see within both the reporter and monitor is you have the ability to see all the registry settings for things that will affect, and this gives you the ability to more finely tune all those settings. So as you highlight a particular entry that's relevant to the registry, it gives you a little bit of information about what this is going to affect, and this can really help tune in large environments to get rid of any noise, just to collect and use that very important data. I said that's available in there and also in here. And you can appreciate, as we're starting to change so many settings, this is why this is a special use feature, almost a secret admin switch. But for scaling, if this is what you're trying to achieve, scaling Veeam ONE in a very large environment, you'll obviously see this as great value. Okay, let's go ahead and close that, and we'll flip back to the slide deck. So what about next in scalability? So what's coming? So what we're going to be doing very soon is pre-calculated data. So enabling even those great enhancements in those generation of reports, we're going to be pre-calculating data, so even faster report generation. We're also bringing independent data collection of events. So it basically, if an event collection fails, it won't hurt any performance collection. Again, we're isolating, like as we've done with the whole process, we're isolating the different collection events. So if one fails, the others don't fail, because they're happening in a parallel, isolated way. What else for scalability? Well, we're going to be looking at a single connection for monitor and reporter collection. So we're deduplicating the connections that we use to collect data. We're also, as we looked at very similar improvement as we looked at parallelizing the process or adding some parallelism to the process of data collection for the backup data. We're also adding that for the vSphere data as well very soon. So here we start to look at some of the helpful scalability tools and guides. You'll see there at the top of the slide the support utility. This is how to get to the Veeam ONE settings with the admin switch. I believe these slides will be made available to you after the session. So you don't necessarily need to take any screenshots or take a photo of this. Also, you can see here the operational database calculator links. So having the ability to size that database, as I said, based on number of VMs, hosts, clusters, data stores. There's also a deployment guide for large environments you can see here. So great tools to use. Some additional Veeam ONE links here as well, looking at the differences between typical and advanced scale modes. We've got the Veeam ONE overview page and a video as well, more for maybe the people that haven't seen so much of Veeam ONE before. Also the what's new, some feedback in the forums. So please, I would encourage you, if you're using Veeam ONE and you're looking at scaling Veeam ONE, spend some time in our forums. There's some great information in there. You can interact with the Veeam team in the forum and get some great information. There's also a couple of links there to case studies as well. If you're interested in looking at other people's experiences of using Veeam ONE at scale, you have those links there available to you as well. So what I'm going to do now is just take a quick look at the questions. A couple of questions from a service provider. Is it possible, or is it that Veeam ONE is available to service providers? Well, yes. There's actually a number of capabilities of Veeam ONE in the free edition for service providers around some of the cloud reporting. Another question here. Can I monitor both Hyper-V and VMware simultaneously? So yes, you can monitor VMware and Hyper-V simultaneously. You would just add them both to the interface, along with, of course, Veeam backup and replication. One more here. Okay, yes, and it's around sort of scaling in live. The question is, if I start with a small environment and maybe have the Veeam ONE server and the SQL server roll together on the same host, maybe when I've got a smaller state and then I grow beyond that, can I expand? Absolutely. There are a number of ways to do this. There's a couple of KB articles that are available on the Veeam website of how to go from that small monolithic stack of Veeam ONE and SQL to a distributed environment, how to dismount, move, and reaccess that database. Okay. Currently in another question here around licensing. How does the licensing work? Well, in a on-prem architecture, so in your own estate, Veeam ONE is licensed the same way as Veeam backup and replication. It's licensed per socket. So if you're monitoring a Hyper-V environment that has maybe, if you look at a small environment, maybe has 10 hosts, average host has 2 CPUs, so that would be 20 licenses of Veeam ONE as it would be with Veeam backup and replication. Just looking through the rest of the questions. Okay, that does seem to be the last question. I'll leave the session open for another 5 minutes or to the to 11:40, just in case there are any additional questions that come up. If there isn't, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for joining the session today on Veeam ONE Scalability, and hopefully you found this session useful. Thank you very much.